share. Thank you. And I'm Land Steward Coordinator. Here's my email. Right now, we're in the process of working through developing presentation ideas and speakers for 2026 into 2027. So it's not too late. If you've got a great idea or a really nice connection to a speaker that you'd like to get in front of the land stewards, just drop me an email and we'll see what we can do to make that happen. That's how some of the best information and speakers come to us, is through our community. And if there's something that you really want to learn about, reach out to me, because I want to queue that up, and that kind of feedback is important for me. A little bit about what we have coming up. Tonight, prescribed burning. And on December 9th, we have understanding the water supply in the Rogue Valley. That's with Paul DiMaggio of Jackson Soil and Water Conservation District. That'll be a great talk. As we move into December, we're kind of, we had a really busy month in November. We had several presentations and a field outing or two. And December is going to be a little quieter as we move into the holidays. But as we come out of that, we have a couple more events planned. They're not up on the schedule yet, but they're coming. We have Stan Dean, who's one of our long-standing land stewards and pond experts. He'll be giving a presentation about ponds and pond management. And that's on January 8th. On February 10th, we're going to have Shannon Rio come back. Shannon gave us a great presentation a couple months back about inviting birds into your backyard. And on February 10th, she's going to be talking more specifically about woodpeckers and sapsuckers and kind of a focus there, which should be interesting too, since a lot of us have forest habitats and snags and things like that. And those are some of the species we can really benefit through some of our work, our stewardship work. So if you're here to learn about prescribed burning for private land stewards in Southwest Oregon, you are in the right place. And I'm really pleased to have Chris Adlam, who's our Southwest Oregon Extension Fire Specialist, and Aaron Krikava, who's with the Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association. Chris is our Southwest Oregon Fire Specialist at Extension. His background is in the study of fire ecology, traditional uses of fire, and the adoption of prescribed burning on private lands. He's an avid naturalist and is passionate about land stewardship and connecting people to the natural role of fire in these landscapes. And I've certainly learned a lot from Chris just in the time that I've known, and I'm looking forward to learning more tonight. Aaron Krikava has lived in the Rogue Valley for 20 years. He's worked as a field production contractor before shifting his career to wildland firefighting. His work is giving insight into the importance of fire as a land management tool, as well as expertise in its safe application. In 2020, he formed the Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association, bringing people together to accomplish controlled burns on private lands for the health and safety of our communities. And both Aaron and Chris were here today at Extension for an agency open house and land steward event we had going on. And Aaron mentioned that that the Prescribed Burn Association here in the Rogue Valley was the first in Oregon, and that they're popping up all over the place now. But again, this region and with people like Aaron, we've got leaders that are moving us forward. We're on the front end of things, so really stoked to hear that. And with that, I'm going to hand it off. Which one of you guys is going to go first? All right, it's going to be Chris. So Chris, I'll stop my share here and you can load up your presentation.
Thanks, Eugene. Hi, everybody. So I'm really glad to be here. This is such an excellent program, the Land Stewards program, and I'm really thankful for all the volunteers and everybody who's put work into this program and making it happen. So I want to start out in our program here thinking about what are some words that you associate with fire. And I see some names, I see some people I recognize, I see some new names. I'm sure we all have different experiences with fire in some way or another. So maybe put those in the chat as we get going on our talk, thinking about what words we associate with fire. Often when we think about fire, we think about some pretty scary things, like this photo at the top. That's the Siskiyou fire in Ashland, which was, I think, roughly 10 years ago. And that's often what we think about. But, fire is not just that. Fire can be something that is a friend. It can be something that is a useful tool on the landscape. The photo on below is a picture of a distant picture of a prescribed burn happening up in the Ashland watershed, protecting our forests and water supply and reducing fuels while improving habitat for many species of understory plants and wildlife. Over time, the relationship that people have had with fire has changed, and I think it's important when we talk about prescribed fire to think about where we come from. In the land acknowledgement that Eugene gave, he mentioned the tribes of this place, and people here for thousands of years have used fire intentionally for many diverse purposes. Perhaps in a future series, there could be a talk about that specifically. But this is a quote from a man we know as Klamath River Jack. 1916, he was writing to his local Forest Service ranger to complain about the policy of putting out all fires. He felt like he had to explain indigenous burning practices. And this is what he said: Indian burn every year, just same. So keep old ground clean, no bark, no dead leaf, no old wood on ground, no old wood on brush, so no bug can stay to eat leaf and no worm can stay to eat berry and acorn. Not much on ground to make hot fire, so never hurt big trees where fire burn. And while we think that settlers came here with inherently just the fear of fire, many people early on understood the wisdom of this. And this is a quote from our local newspaper, the Jacksonville Democratic Times. In 1903, an anonymous writer was complaining about the new developments in fire policy. One of the greatest pieces of folly is preventing fires to be set in the hills and government reservations until the brush and undergrowth become so high and thick that when the inevitable fire comes, the whole forest is destroyed. Old settlers and Indians know that the only safe method is to annually burn off the undergrowth when it is so thin that it would not endanger the big trees. Then the grass can grow and you have a beautiful forest instead of a fire trap. Over time, the policy of fire exclusion became the policy that was adopted in our region, in our country. And this was much to the dismay of forest managers in many parts of the West. The California State Forester in 1910 said, "I'm afraid that under the total protection system, the fire exclusion system, that the thicket conditions will get so bad that the present stand will be unreasonably endangered. I fear that a crown fire will be the result. When conditions reach that stage, I do not see how we can control the fires with any number of men whatsoever." Clinton Walker, who was part of a lumber company at the time in 1910, wrote, "I take it that the fires will run through the timber in spite of all that can be done. Hence, let us choose our time and conditions for burning so as to do the least amount of damage. By burning often enough, there will not be an accumulation enough on the ground to do any material damage." Similar sentiment from the Southern Pacific Railway. "I respectfully request that you have an investigation made and see if we cannot work out some practical plan to systematically burn over the forests at the right time of the year. Remove the cause of the fires and there will be no necessity of filling in the woods with firefighters." And lastly, a quote from a rancher in California saying, "We are painstakingly building a fire trap that will piecemeal but in the long run completely defeat the aim of fire protection itself." So there was a lively debate about how we should approach fire at this time. And the direction that was eventually taken was indeed the policy of excluding fire from the landscape, of trying to eliminate fire as much as possible from the landscape. Aldo Leopold made fun of the proponents of using fire by essentially calling them savages, and saying that that was really a backwoods philosophy used by indigenous people that had no place in the modern world. He said, "The Forest Service policy of absolutely preventing forest fires insofar as humanly possible is directly threatened by the light burning propaganda," as it was called then. It is up to the public and especially the users of the forest to decide whether they wish that policy continued or whether they wish to try Paiute forestry. He later, I think, came around, but this was the policy that was adopted, and the government invested in propaganda campaigns, some of which made fun of indigenous people, as you can see, and that Smokey Bear ad. And they even hired psychologists to try and understand why people would set fire to their own land. It seemed like such a crazy idea. So that is then, and over time, over the course of the 20th century, that policy evolved. Prescribed fire eventually was allowed once again on federal lands in 1943, and in many places it never really fell out of usage. In California, range improvement associations continued to burn and were burning up to 200,000 acres per year in the 1950s. And even today, in many places, this is an intergenerational practice that remains. These are pictures from Douglas County, where ranchers continue to use fire to manage their pastures. Across the country, we burn about 10 million acres a year, and most of that is in the southeast. Florida, for example, burns as much every year as California will burn in 50 years. So they have something going on down there that we might want to learn from. And across the country as well, we've seen more and more people learning about prescribed fire, learning how to use prescribed fire, working together, forming these prescribed burn associations, which we'll talk about more in a second. And indigenous tribes, again, also revitalizing their traditional burning practices, bringing that back. A lot of policy changes happening at both state and federal level that is moving along the situation. There's new certification programs, different kinds of funds for dealing with costs associated with prescribed fire, and a lot of conversations happening all up and down. Still a long way to go, but the awareness of the importance of this tool is definitely on the rise. Now, what is a prescribed burn? I want to just show some pictures because, again, we're used to seeing very scary pictures when we think of fire. It's a lot of wildfire, but prescribed burns, one of the things we hear on our prescribed burns most often is it feels a lot less scary than people expected. People find it beautiful. People find it calm. And those are things I like to hear. And unfortunately, I hear pretty much every single time. That's the feedback that we get. So first off, how a prescribed burn works is that we use our knowledge of fire, of how fire behaves, in order to keep things safe. And this is important because we often think that fire is a unpredictable, scary, maybe even malicious force. But in fact, just like water, fire is very predictable. And so in our prescribed burns, we'll start our fire on the downwind side or on the uphill side. And then we're going to work against the wind. We're against the slope, going down slope, so that the fire keeps burning into the previously burned area. Of course, all around the area, we have control lines that are not flammable, right? That the fire breaks so that fire will not be able to creep out. And then people use different techniques around the outside to make sure that fire stays inside of our box. We call those people around the outside the holding resources, and then the igniters on the inside are using different lighting techniques to manipulate the intensity of the fire. So there's a lot of ways that we can maintain control over fire and maintain safe burns. Some pictures of burns. These are from earlier this year. Some of them from longer ago, but this is from the Siskiyou Field Institute in Selma in the Illinois Valley. And this is a site where we've done both prescribed fire trainings and cultural burns, working with members of the Siletz and Grand Ronde tribes that are particularly interested in these areas because of the really amazing legacy oak trees that are hundreds and hundreds of years old and that are dependent on the use of fire, without which they get outcompeted by other tree species like conifers. Very quickly, within a couple of weeks, the vegetation is already sprouting back. the grass, the ferns, because all of these plants and animals are adapted to fire. Fire used to occur very frequently in this region, and so um, it's really unnatural to not have fire for 100 years. Most of these plants are totally adapted to it, have root systems that allow them to resprout. By getting rid of the duff on the forest floor and all the litter, we are enabling new plants, species to take root and seeds to germinate. Most seeds of native plants cannot germinate through thick layers of duff and litter, which were not the rule historically when fire was more present. You can also see some of the needles on the lower branches of the trees are dead, and that might seem unseemly, but that is also raising the height to the lowest branches. So if there is a wildfire in this area, those trees are now limbed up, and it will be naturally harder for the fire to go up into those trees and cause damage that way. We've been doing burns in the Collins Demonstration Forest, the OSU Forest up in Gold Hill. These burns are all open to members of the public if you are interested in joining us. This is a little before and after picture. And this also with some of my colleagues, we burnt an area late winter, and within the 2 or 3 weeks, we had blooming paintbrush and lupins coming up and many other native plant species. These are some pictures of burns also in Southwest Oregon. Most of these are pictures from burns organized by the Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association on different private land ownerships. And so you can see it's very, very far cry from what we imagine when we think of wildfires, right? I wonder if there are any questions in the chat, Eugene. Is there anything, or does anybody, if you have any questions,
Nothing's
please
coming
put them in
yet.
the chat. Okay. Great. So it is a bit of work and planning, right? It takes some planning to do something like this. So some people might be asking, well, can't we just thin and be done? Right? It's already a lot of work to thin the forest. We usually have to thin before we can do a prescribed burn. So couldn't we just thin and call it good? Well, there's a couple of things. One is that thinning, a lot of material is left on the ground after thinning. You can see in this picture, a lot of material still left. And so prescribed fire goes through and cleans up a lot of that leftover material that is really important in fueling the severity of a potential wildfire. Another thing is that if you want the ecological benefits, you want to see the benefit to the native plants and to all of the animals and insects that depend on them, fire is really important. This is a quote, the second quote here is from a study that found that neither burning nor thinning alone significantly increased the understory plant richness or cover. Thinning increased richness and cover, but only when followed by fire. So really the combination of thinning and prescribed burning was essential to increase the diversity of that ecosystem. And if you think about it, if you have a really dense forest, unnaturally dense because of 100 years of removing fire from the landscape, and you underburn it without thinning, you haven't really corrected the problem. The forest floor is still very dark. There's no sunshine reaching the forest floor, so a lot of our native plants aren't going to be able to make it. And if you thin, but you don't burn, then you're not correcting what's happening on the floor, on the forest floor level of all the dead material building up and smothering all the native plants. So it's really that combination of thinning and burning that is ideal for improving the health of that understory. Another thing is that suppressing fires, is the strategy that we've adopted in the last 100 years. We're just going to put fires out and it's going to not be a problem anymore. And we can see today that that's clearly not working, and it's never going to be enough. Those graphs show that burned area has been increasing. This is over the course of the last 40 years. And the cost of fighting fires has been increasing pretty much at a similar rate, right? So the more we spend money on trying to put fires out, the worse they get. And that is something that is very well understood. And the situation is rapidly becoming untenable. The cost of fighting fires last year was $350 million in Oregon alone. And you know how much they had allocated to fight fires? 10 million. So there's a problem. That amount that was spent on fighting fires is equivalent to the anticipated budget shortfall of the next 2 years, or 13% of the general fund for the next biennium. So it's really economically becoming a huge issue that we are having to spend so much money on firefighting, $3 billion every year in the US. And yet we know that this is not going to reverse the trends, that the area burned will continue to increase no matter what we do, and that if we don't manage our forests properly, then the severity or the proportion of trees killed right over a given area in a wildfire is also going to increase. We're going to see increased damages. So we really need to invest much, much more on putting fire back on the ground in conditions that allow for the types of outcomes that we can live with. Studies show that thinning and burning are really effective practices for reducing wildfire severity, right? This is a study that shows, you can see different situations, that those pictures, untreated areas, thinning only, prescribed burn only, and thinning and burning. And the graph on the right, what that's looking at, zero line, you see that dotted line, that means no change in wildfire severity. They researched a bunch of different, they looked at a bunch of different studies and found that thinning only has some benefit, but not the most, right? Wildfire, if there was a previous wildfire, under some circumstances, that will moderate the behavior of future fires, but not always. A prescribed burn, that has a lot more benefit. Thinning and pile burning, and thinning and prescribed burning, the bottom one, you can see that all of those dots are way to the left of that zero line, meaning that there was a change, a significant change in wildfire severity. Thinning and burning was found to reduce the wildfire severity by 72%. And that's a huge, huge difference. We have lots of evidence for this from real life situations as well. This is from the Bootleg fire in 2021. The area in the middle was thinned and prescribed burned. The area on the left was only thinned, and the area on the right had no treatment. And this was an extremely, extremely intense fire, really strong winds, hot, dry, worst case scenario type of conditions. And prescribed burning and followed after thinning still works. It works even under really horrific weather conditions like they saw during that fire. This is a picture from the ground level, so you can appreciate what the two stands look like after the wildfire. This is a picture, these are pictures from a prescribed burn association that helped a landowner do a burn in Greenville, a town in Northern California that also burned in 2021 in the Dixie Fire. And you can see that little green island is the 7-acre prescribed burn that this landowner did with their PBA around their property. And their property survived, that most of their trees survived. And very unfortunately, that was not the case for many neighbors. So we know that this works. How do you get a prescribed burn on your land, if that is your interest, though? There are a lot of obstacles, right? And it's not necessarily easy. It can be a project that'll take a while to figure out how to make it work for your land and your objectives. But you have a few options. One is to hire a contractor. One is to get help from perhaps some agencies, fire departments, or other organizations. On small scales, maybe you can do it yourself. And option number 4 is to work with a local prescribed burn association. If you want to hire a contractor, there's some benefits to that. they will take on the liability partially. I mean, if you're a landowner, you have liability for anything that happens on your land. You can't really get rid of that. It's part of the responsibility of owning land. But the contractors will have insurance and take that on to the degree that they can. Many of our contractors are highly experienced and they know what they're doing. They have a lot of equipment. They have a lot of experience. And so, as a landowner, you don't really have to do much at all. They'll take care of all the planning. They'll get it done. The cons is that it will cost $15,000 to $20,000 minimum. So that's kind of cost prohibitive for many people, especially if it needs to happen every few years. Contractors there are some, but there aren't very many who do prescribed burning. We have some in our area. So this would be really a good option for much larger or more complex burns, but perhaps not so much if you have a few acres that you want to burn, right? Because they come with a 20-acre minimum because of the amount of resources that they need to provide. The second option is to see if you can get help from other agencies locally. It has been the case that BLM or the Forest Service have used agreements to burn across their property lines onto private land. That's happened a few times, and so it is possible. It might take a while. You might also contact your local fire department. Different organizations like watershed councils might have connections or ideas for how you can start the process of maybe getting a grant or help you just understand if prescribed fire is the right thing for your land. NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, ODF, Department of Forestry, and of course OSU Extension can also help give you advice and work with you to make a plan. It's sort of unlikely that you're going to find somebody who can just come and do a burn for you. But if you're adjacent to public lands, for example, or if you have a very active fire department in your area that's very pro-prescribed fire, you might be able to make some good connections there. One option is to do it yourself, which might sound surprising to some people. And of course, this is something that is not recommended unless you have a lot of fire experience. But some people do small areas on their property, a little bit at a time, and it really kind of adds up over time. This is a property here, pictures from Rich Fairbanks's property in the Applegate, and he's a retired firefighter, so he knows what he's doing, and he's done a lot of thinning. He's gotten the land really ready to a point where it's easy for him to start a little fire, and it'll stop at the nearby trail or road. And little bit by little bit, it adds up. So some of the advantages, it's something that you can do by yourself. You don't need to rely on anyone else. But of course, you need to have a lot of experience and training, equipment. You need to get help from family and friends, which that could be a pro or a con, depending on your family and friends. And it's probably only going to be good for doing really small burns under low complexity conditions outside of fire season, right? Very, very simple stuff. Lastly, the option of working with a prescribed burn association, if you have one in your area, that might be a good option. Prescribed burn associations are helping neighbors type of organizations, really landowners just working together. It originated out of the Great Plains, where ranchers have been doing this, helping one another pool resources and equipment and skills so that they can do these burns on a scale that you couldn't do by yourself. And prescribed burn associations are really expanding right now across Oregon. And so if you have one in your area, it's a good way to connect with other people who have the same kind of interests. Prescribed burn associations have experienced individuals who can help you with burn planning. They provide training. So if you are not sure if a prescribed burn association is the right thing for you, you could still go and observe prescribed burn association burn and take part in a burn and see how you feel about it. It really brings down costs by sharing equipment and relying on volunteers. And it's also a good thing to build community, get to know your neighbors, and work together to do something kind of hard, but that when people get together and do it, it's a real sense of achievement. You can really appreciate the significant difference you've made to improve the health of the forest and reduce risk to your community. Some downsides of working with PBAs, the PBAs do not remove liability from landowner. Like I said earlier, nothing really can totally, but you have to take that responsibility as a landowner since you're basically relying on volunteer help to help staff your burn. There might be a wait time. There's a lot of interest in prescribed burns, so sometimes you might have to wait in line for a bit, and of course there might not be a PBA in your area yet. Across Oregon, we've gone from 2 to 10 PBAs over the last year. So like I said, really expanding rapidly throughout the state. So hopefully this is something that more and more people have awareness of, and even if it's not the right thing for you, it's a good chance to learn about fire and get together with your neighbors. So I'm winding down my presentation. I just want to leave you with some photos. Good fire. This is what we're trying to get at. It's the kind of fire that we can live with, and that's going to look different for different people. Maybe it's doing piles. I'm sure many of you have burnt a pile or two, and I found that I really appreciate getting together with neighbors and burning piles together. It's pretty fun. More and more people are learning about using fire, and in some cases, like this picture on the right, this is a cultural burn by members of the Siletz and Grand Ronde tribes in the Willamette Valley that was completely ignited without any drip torch fuel and only using traditional ignition devices. And you can see there's youth participating and learning these traditional ways. So that's really really essential that we remember where this practice comes from, that it has deep roots, and that we uplift the opportunities for indigenous communities to continue using their traditions, even as we learn about how to put fire on the ground as settlers. And some pictures from our local prescribed burn association. You can see, look at all these people having a good time. Look at all these people having a good time. That's one of my favorite things, honestly, about this is the work that's happening is great, but just the fact that people are learning to see that there is a way that we can live with fire going forward, that it's not all doom and gloom, that we can be empowered to do these kinds of things as a community and make a real difference. I'm wondering if you want to think back to the question of what words do you associate with fire? And check in with yourselves to see if that's changed. It's a lot. Fire is a lot. It's a hard neighbor to live with. And so I think it's understandable to have a lot of complicated feelings about fire. But my hope is that the more we learn about it, the more we can learn that it has a good side and a side that we can live with and use for the betterment of our communities and our landscapes. That's my presentation. I'll turn it over to Aaron Krikava now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And some of those words were, rebuilding soil, renewal, fertility, connection. Hey, I have a question. I guess as you were talking about the options for prescribed burning, I was thinking, maybe if you hire a contractor, they do that first burn. I'm thinking the first burn's probably the scariest and maybe the most complex, and that future burns after that could be easier. But is that assumption correct?
Definitely. That's definitely the case. The first one is harder because we have 100 years of accumulated material to deal with. And that's not just the trees and the shrubs, it's sometimes the thick layers of pine needles, sometimes it's stumps, right? We're often in areas where there's been trees, old growth trees have probably been cut, and you sometimes have really big stumps that will burn over a long period of time after that first burn you do in there. So um, oftentimes that first one, and it's also about learning, right? The one thing that's really cool about fire, I think, is the aspect of just learning from that environment. And after you do it one time, you'll know the next time, oh, we got to watch out about this thing, or I noticed that the weather, the wind patterns change over the course of the day. And so all of these little things that you learn, as of course as you start doing that over and over again, you will be able to implement that and think back to that and adapt your relationship to the landscape based on your observations. So yeah, it's really important that we're all always learning. It's very humbling really working with fire because we're always going to be students, right? We're always going to have to approach it with curiosity and respect and learn. So yeah, to your question, maybe it makes sense to have a contractor come in and do the first burn if it's really complicated, and then it's possible that you could turn it over to a landowner or to a prescribed burn association after that. But prescribed burn associations can usually composed of people who are themselves contractors in their work job, right? So they have the knowledge and skill that they often bring to the prescribed burn association, and so usually it's fine for the prescribed burn association to do that burn too. I don't. I think it's more of a size thing sometimes. Some of the contractors have very advanced technologies like drones and things like that, that if they wanted to do hundreds of acres, they could do that, which might not be within reach for a prescribed burn association, for example.
All right, thanks for that. So I guess the bottom line there is that it can get easier. You got to get that first burn down and work into it. We have one other question from Meredith, just
Mm-hmm.
asking, can you talk more about those traditional ignition devices and
Yeah.
what are the options generally? And then we'll transition to Aaron.
Most prescribed burns, people use what we call drip torches, that are canisters with a wick on the end, and it basically drips a mixture of diesel and gasoline out that combusts, and that's how you spread fire. They're really handy because it's very reliable and quick. Um, some of the cultural burns that we're seeing happening within tribal communities, people will use those, and sometimes they prefer to avoid using them if they're, for example, in areas that have traditional foods and they want to avoid the use of diesel and drip torch fuel, right? And so sometimes people will use, for example, pitch sticks. If you are familiar with old stumps that have pitch wood in them, those burn very readily and for a long time. And so people sometimes use those, and they've adapted different technologies, like bundles of plants that basically kind of like a big smudge stick. People will use those, sometimes dipped in pitch so that they have an extra flammable um, property. So and all of those things are things that people are developing and using and refining, and it's part of a long lineage of uh, relationship with fire. That, like I said earlier, I think maybe next series, we should have a presenter. We could see if we could make that happen. There's so much to learn. There's so much to learn.
Thank you. Well, I'll invite Aaron to uh, join us and load up his slide deck.
Thanks, Eugene. Um,
Thanks for being here and for putting in a long day too, helping out with the Land Stewards event here today. Appreciate you.
it's always my pleasure. The Land Stewards is really an inspiring group for sure. And thank you, Chris, for your presentation. Even after 5 years of working together, I always learn something from your presentations. And it's really an honor to collaborate with you. So again, my name is Aaron Krikava, the coordinator of the Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association. And after that great presentation from Chris, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the details of how a prescribed burn is implemented. And I'm going to start off by talking about the term prescribed burning because I find that it's sometimes confusing and used in different ways in our community. So it's really an umbrella term that can cover pile burning, broadcast burning, and understory burning. So pile burning is where we collect material together, usually cut with chainsaws or masticators or something like that into individual piles, and then we burn those piles as individual units. I think a lot of us have done that normally. It's a part of doing the fuel reduction work that we're all familiar with. And then broadcast burning is burning grass generally or fields without trees or shrubs included. And then understory burning is burning the material within a forest. And I say that understory burning and broadcast burning are really what we're talking about when we discuss prescribed burning and what the Prescribed Burn Association is really focused on. And this can be confusing because the word prescribed burning also includes pile burning. So if you have apps like Watch Duty, you can see little green RX symbols all over the state. And those are really 99% of the time pile burns, not understory burns like we're talking about. So there aren't hundreds of understory burns going on across the state. There's hundreds of pile burns going on across the state. And also sometimes in news or other media, they'll discuss, a 50-acre prescribed burn occurring in the Ashland watershed or somewhere else in Jackson County. And they're really almost always talking about pile burning, not understory burning. There's very little understory burning or broadcast burning actually going on in our community, unfortunately. And I think it's important to understand that nuance. So when I'm talking about prescribed burning this evening, I'm really primarily talking about broadcast burning and understory burning. So what are the reasons that people burn? As Chris mentioned, this is a natural process. We live in fire-adapted ecosystem that historically low-intensity fire crossed our landscape every 7 to 10 years. So again, one of those really low-intensity fires that you saw in Chris's pictures crossed our landscape, reducing fuels, cycling nutrients back into the soil, and promoting the growth of native species was happening regularly. And as some examples, this is a photo from about a month after a burn on BLM land out in the Applegate. You can see fritillera blooming. There's some miner's lettuce in the background and a couple other species in between. These are native plants that really like that dose of nutrients they're getting and the extra sunlight they're getting from having the overstory cleared out. Here's a picture of a couple of plants resprouting a week after a burn that we did. And these nice young fresh shoots also produce better quality browse. And, ranchers burn across the country regularly because they understand that that fresh green grass is more nutritious and more edible to their cows. But also natives like ungulates, like elk and deer, really like those fresh sprouts that come out after we have our burns. It's sort of like nature's way of deadheading their garden. A fire would come through, new fresh shoots would come out, it would reinvigorate the plants. And so there's a lot of different benefits we get from reintroducing fire in this way. Also, it's very beneficial for reducing invasive plants. Star thistle especially, in California and many other parts throughout Oregon, they use prescribed burning to get rid of star thistle. So these plants that are invasive aren't necessarily adapted to fire the same way our native plants are. And so using that as a tool to remove them helps the native plants outcompete the invasives when they get burned back and remove the invasives in general. And then it's also a great training opportunity A lot of fire departments and wildland fire contractors like to work on prescribed burns because live fire training is a rare event, and it really helps these people to be better prepared for when they do have to suppress fire, which is something that is also necessary at times. And generally, the most common reason we hear for using prescribed burning is to reduce fuels and to increase wildfire resilience. I'm going to use the same pictures that Chris used, but just to reiterate that this example from the bootleg fire is really important. You can see on the right where no treatment happened, the forest was totally devastated and destroyed. The area on the left where they did thinning, reduced the number of trees per acre, they did mechanical fuel reduction, they did the pile burning, and yet still the trees weren't immediately destroyed, but because of the intensity of the heat, they still died soon afterwards. The area in the middle where they were able to do the understory burning that helped remove those fine fuels that helped carry the fire, those trees still lived afterwards. And I know which one I would like my personal forest to look like is definitely the one in the middle. And again, that example from the Dixie fire, many of the prescribed burns that the PBA does are actually very small, just a few acres, less than 10. But we try and focus those efforts on the areas around people's homes because those are the points that we want to be most protected and the most alive after a fire comes through. So even small treatments like this one that was only 7 acres really have a major benefit in the long term. So it's not easy to do a prescribed burn. There's a lot of different steps to it. And so I kind of want to walk through those steps so you have a better understanding of what goes into the process. So the first step is to do an initial site visit and evaluation. An experienced practitioner can come out and talk to you, whether it's a contractor or somebody from a prescribed burn association, and kind of look at your property and better assess what the factors are that are going to influence whether a prescribed burn is really right for you. One of the first questions we like to ask is, what are you trying to accomplish with your prescribed burn? Because it might not be the right tool for your particular location. Many of the things we look at are fuel loading, control lines, how steep your property is, what kind of hazards there are. Is there like a big rock cliff somewhere in there? Are there any water resources nearby, like a pond or a fire hydrant or something like that? Also logistics, how easy is it to get to this location? Is it 3 miles up a 2-track road that would be really difficult to get fire engines up? All of these things kind of play into the process of evaluating a property. So I've been brought out to properties like this where somebody says, I want to do a prescribed burn on this unit. And I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You definitely don't want to do a prescribed burn on your property if it looks like this. You need to do that mechanical fuel reduction that we're talking about first to try and reduce some of this brush and fuel before we can apply fire in a safe manner. Here's another example. You can't walk 10 feet through this forest. I don't think I want to put fire on the ground. But if you do some mechanical fuel reduction first, do the pile burning, then we can get these properties to look more like this picture or this picture. And you can see this forest looks really healthy. And at the same time, there's still a lot of fuel along the ground that if a wildfire did come through this property, there would still be a really large amount of heat and intensity that could kill the roots and also creep up into the trees and kill some of the trees that are above it. So we need to do that mechanical fuel reduction, reduce these fuels. Again, 100 years of fire suppression with a historic 10-year fire interval, like that's 10 times as much fuel as on the ground as would historically have been there. So we need to use other means to reduce that fuel to a safer level before we reintroduce fire as a tool on the landscape. And we don't want to look at just the fuel with inside the unit. We also need to look at the fuel outside of the unit because the area outside of our prescribed burn is actually the area that will define how many control people we need, how many holders, how many fire engines, that kind of stuff we need, because we're not actually worried about how the fire is going to act inside the unit. We're worried about if the fire gets outside of the unit, how are we going to stop it from actually getting out of our control? So if your property is well thinned, but your neighbor's is still in a state where fire would be catastrophic on it, we probably don't want to burn all the way to your property line. We kind of want to create a buffer between the two so that we can make sure if fire does get outside of our control lines, we still can stop it in a safe and easy way. So the next thing that we look at when we're trying to develop a prescribed burn is the control lines. Where are we going to start and stop our fire in a controlled manner? The ideal situation is a road. You have roads all the way around a unit that make it very simple and easy to start and stop your burn. The next best is hand lines in our area, which is essentially clearing the soil down to mineral dirt for 12 to 18 inches. And that can also be an effective control feature. When we're burning more in grass fields and doing more of that broadcast burning, plow lines are a very common methodology. They'll take a tractor or a plow and just plow all the grass in an 8 to 10 foot wide strip. And then that obviously makes a very effective control feature to start and stop our prescribed burns. So here's a few examples of burns that we've done with the Prescribed Burn Association. This one was on Anderson Creek Road. You can see we had Anderson Creek Road as our bottom edge, and then we used some driveways along the top edge as our primary control features, and then we did hand lines down the slope. So a combination of hand lines and roads was used to create our box that we were going to keep our fire within. This is another unit we've been working on, Wayne Iva's property outside of Ashland. He has a driveway along the bottom edge of his slope and then along the top of it to his house. And then we made a hand line down the slope to connect the two roads. So this triangle makes a very convenient area for us to do our controlled burn. And doing this is strategic because it's below his house. So if a wildfire were to come up the creek and burn up his slope, it wouldn't be as intense when it got to his house. So it was more likely that his house would be saved in that instance. Here's a third one that we did. It's a narrow triangle, but again, we used roads and dirt lines and paved roads, as well as a small hand line on the upper left side to create our little triangle and implement our burn. So slope is a big part of what we consider, because if it's too steep for somebody to walk on, we're probably not going to burn that because it'll be dangerous for any of our igniters or the people trying to hold the fire, as well as fire really likes to go uphill quickly, and that would really increase the hazard and the intensity of the fire. So again, hazards we look at are power lines or cliffs or any sort of other geographic feature that would make it complicated for people to actually walk around and work with. Then we look at water sources and logistics. And then once we've kind of covered all of these bases, then we start working on a burn plan. And burn plans can seem intimidating, but there's a lot of parts of them that are easily accomplished by a landowner if they're working with somebody who's willing to let the landowner participate in that. And the burn plan kind of lays out how many fire engines, how many personnel, what kind of temperature and humidity conditions they need, and the general way that the prescribed burn is going to be implemented. Then once the burn plan is developed, you can move forward with preparing the burn plan. Perhaps you need to put some plow lines in, maybe some hand lines need to be constructed. And once all of those factors are taken care of, then we can move forward with getting the required permits. There's approximately 4 different ODF permits that need to be applied for in order to implement a prescribed burn. The initial one is FERNS, which is the Forest Activity Electronic Reporting and Notification System, which is more or less a notification letting ODF know that you're planning on using fire on your property. And once they approve that notification, then they'll tell you which steps you need to step through next. The next major one is trying to get a burn permit from your local ODF office. So they'll come out, take a look at your burn plan, look at the unit, look at your control lines, and make a decision about whether they approve your understory burn or not, and under the conditions with which they'll allow you to do your understory burn. Now, these burn permits, unfortunately, are only for 15 days, but once you have the burn permit in place, they generally can offer you extensions beyond that 15-day period. Another thing that you're going to want to enter into is the prescribed fire liability program, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, but this will help give you some liability protection in case something goes wrong. And then fourthly, there's Oregon's smoke registration and smoke management, which controls whether you're allowed to release the amount of smoke that you need to release for your burn. As I mentioned, the legislative things going on most recently have allowed for the Certified Burn Manager program, which is a state level certification allowing for a prescribed burn manager managing your fire to remove any liability from any of the participants if something should go wrong and your fire should escape. And on top of that, if something did go wrong and you were held liable, the Prescribed Fire Liability Fund offers $1 million in coverage if something should go to court and there should be some liability found. So both of these actions from the legislature to try and improve the use of prescribed fire have really benefited private landowners and made them feel more comfortable in moving forward with implementing prescribed fire on their property. So once you've done all this, you have your permits in place, you would look for a good weather window, which is often complicated in our region because you need to both have your fuels dry enough to burn, but the general weather conditions of humidity and wind and temperature appropriate to allow for controlled and moderate fire activity. So once you see that sort of window occurring, then you would notify your neighbors or other participants who are going to be involved with the contractor who's going to be making the burn happen. And then you would notify your fire district and local phone trees so that your neighbors aren't really scared and the fire department doesn't come to respond to your burn. Then the day before you would do this burn, you would request your final clearance from smoke management in the afternoon. So this complicates everything, obviously, because you can be all ready to go. Everything can look great. The weather can be perfect, and smoke management can tell you that they're not going to approve your burn and your burn gets shut down. And that's really unfortunate, but it does occur sometimes. So if you do get that smoke clearance, then you get to move forward with your burn. Now, the way prescribed burns are implemented is often surprising to some people. Even some staff at ODF have been surprised by this, but you start at the top of your unit. If you imagine that this slide I'm showing you, the top of the slide is the top of a hill, and the bottom of the slide is the bottom of the hill. You start at the top and then slowly work down, allowing a backing fire, which is slower and more controlled, to progress down the slope. ODF thought that you start fires at the bottom of the slope and let you run up, but that's not actually how prescribed burns are implemented. Similarly, if this were a flat unit, just grass or a flat area, you would start at the downwind side of it. So again, the fire is slowly working against the wind rather than running with the wind or running up the slope. This is a somewhat more complex picture, giving you an idea of kind of how it would look on your landscape. Again, on the left side, we see a natural fire break of a creek that the fire was started at. And then there's a road on one side and some constructed hand lines around the edges. And they again started from the upwind side to create their black line and slowly work the fire into the wind or downhill, because fire runs much slower downhill or into the wind. And so that allows us to control the rate at which the fire spreads. After initially starting the fire and creating our black line, it creeps down the hill slowly. This is a picture of a very moderate, normal kind of prescribed burn. And then we often, once this black line is created, do what's called strip firing. So in this instance, you can see the gentleman in the black shirt has already created his strip of fire. And then the person in the green has moved maybe 3 or 5 feet further down the slope and is 20 feet behind the first person. Now they're going to start slowly dripping their fire along the unit so that the fire can burn upslope into an already burned area. Another method that's often used, depending on the fuel types, is dot firing. So you don't have to introduce a whole strip of flames. You can do small dots of fire that will then creep together and consume all of the fuel in between it. Then we let the fire work our way down. Again, in this picture, you can see 3 different igniters starting across the hill slope to try and make these strip head fire to combine into burn the fuel that's available there. Now, you might think that once we're done with the burn, that's it. But really, the most important part is the mop up and patrol. So that means after we're done burning the unit, we're going to go around and try and extinguish anything like stumps that are still burning around the edge of the fire or any major areas of concern where we think the fire might get beyond our control features afterwards. This is the primary time when controlled burns are known to escape, is within this mop up and patrol factor. It's rarely when the burn's happening because we have so many fire engines and personnel on site. But during mop up and patrol is when we need to be extra careful. And then patrol extends as long as is defined by ODF's permit. It's generally 3 days of no heat and no smoke in a row. So every day after one of our burns, somebody will go and monitor it, usually the landowner, or if you're hiring a contractor, the contractor will come and monitor your burn every day until they have 3 days in a row where there's no detected smoke and no detected heat anywhere on the burn unit. And then the burn can be considered out and you can move on. So the barriers to prescribed burning and why more private landowners don't do prescribed burns are detailed here. When we've done research and asked landowners, this is what they say. This is obviously a really complicated process. And if you don't have the training and experience to do it, I don't recommend any landowners go into trying to accomplish this. So lack of training and experience is number one. The second is personnel and capacity. Again, it takes a large number of people doing the ignitions, doing the holding, and organizing a fire like this. And 1 or 2 landowners would have a really hard time accomplishing it on their own in a safe manner. Then lack of equipment. Most landowners don't have a fire engine. They don't have drip torches. They don't have pumps and hose lay equipment and things like that to safely accomplish a burn. So that precludes them being able to do it. And then weather, again, we're dealing with very narrow weather constraints that it's difficult to get the right fuel level, fuel dryness, and cool enough temperatures, but still warm enough to implement a burn. And then concerns about liability and risk. All of these things prevent landowners from accomplishing prescribed burns, but working with a prescribed burn association, they can overcome a lot of these issues. Coming out to one of our events, learning how a prescribed burn is implemented, learning all the processes, and then you can increase capacity and get more landowners involved. Your neighbors can come out. Most of our prescribed burns have 40 to 60 volunteers that come out to do this. And it's sort of a classic rural strategy. We used to do barn raisings or cattle brandings and things like that, or haying. Landowners would work together to accomplish this stuff historically, and we can do that again with something like a prescribed burn association. And then sharing equipment. The prescribed burn association has a large cache of equipment. There's a lot of volunteers who also have fire engines that will come out and donate their time and equipment for this. Then the planning and organizing that the prescribed burn association offers allows for us to take advantage of these short weather windows when we have just the right conditions to safely implement a prescribed burn. And then working with the prescribed burn association and the certified burn managers who are members of the PBA allow us to manage that risk and prevent those liability concerns that inhibit some landowners from wanting to move forward with something like that. So again, a prescribed burn association is a volunteer group of people working together to accomplish this. It's not an agency, it's not a nonprofit, it's people like you in the community and other volunteers working together to try and get this important tool back on the landscape and try and reintroduce fire in our land. Beyond helping facilitate prescribed burns like this, PBAs also do educational events and tours like pile burn workshops, hose lay implementation and installation workshops, site evaluation workshops, water handling design and slip-on unit workshops. So there's a lot of other educational aspects and things that you can learn from working with your local PBA. And I highly recommend signing up and getting involved with those organizations if you're interested in moving forward with this sort of work. So again, thank you. Any questions?
Thanks, Aaron. That's really a lot of great information. We did have some questions. Chris has been kind of answering on the fly, but Tom had asked about um, if there's other permits involved, if you just want to pile burn. And Chris responded to him that if you're keeping it under 100 piles or roughly 10 tons, that you just need to call the burn phone and make sure it's a burn day. So that's great. Thanks for putting the number in there too. Super important number when you're a landowner in this region, and kind of always challenging to, hit that burn day when you can get your piles burned and stuff. So good to have that number on speed dial if you're going to be pile burning. Alan asked if the Oregon liability plan covers damages to one's own property or only if it gets away onto a neighboring property. And Chris had responded to that, that it covers damages to a third party, like a neighbor, but not on your own property. Is that your understanding too, Aaron?
It is my understanding too, but I think it's also important to understand that within the creation of the Certified Burn Manager program, it also says if a burn is conducted by a certified burn manager, nobody's going to be held liable. And so my understanding is that would include the landowner. But again, this is stuff that hasn't been ever gone to court before because prescribed burns on private land haven't really escaped in Oregon and gone to court. So it's uncertain what would happen. It's just such a safe practice that the risk isn't really there,
We had Tom asked another question about how common is it to have the wind direction and the slope of the forest, line up favorably? And what do you do if that just doesn't happen?
I would say that generally, as long as I much prefer working on a sloped property because the wind is much more malleable and can shift and change. And so when you're burning on flat land, it's much more shifty. Obviously, the wind is shifty. So if you actually have some slope, it's a lot easier to work with that because you can almost always start at the top of the slope and work your way down. And rarely, depending on, as long as you're not just in grass, if you actually have some timber litter or something like that, wind will almost never overcome slope. So as long as you have some slope to work with, you're pretty safe. And again, people burn on flat grass all the time. So there's generally a way you can make it work as long as you time it correctly.
Tessa asks, is it worse to have piles on your property that haven't been burned by the time fire season comes back around, or to not have done the cleanup and piling at all?
I'll take that one. I mean, if you have piles on your property for one fire season, during which time they're curing and drying out to be burned in the following fall, that's a pretty small risk compared to having an unthinned forest in perpetuity, right? So, yeah, theoretically, if you just thinned and you put those piles there and really bad luck, that's when the wildfire comes, that's not going to be great. Those piles burning hot in a wildfire situation can be problematic. But again, it's only for one fire season. And so the odds that you're going to have a wildfire encounter your property that just at that time, it would be pretty low odds. I hope that answers.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I have a question kind of along those lines too, which is, say you thinned your property or did some mechanical fuels reduction there 5 years ago, and now you're finally like, okay, I think I could actually get into this prescribed burn, and want to go that direction. But in your experience, do the fuels grow back in that amount of time, or what is the sort of time frame between mechanical thinning and when you could reintroduce fire? Is there sort of is it 10 years? I mean, it probably depends by site and lots of things, but do you guys have any thoughts on that? Like, is there a point at which you're going to have to go back and mechanically thin again?
I Again, it's going to depend on site, and I would say that anytime you can get prescribed fire on the ground is good. If you can do it the year after you've done your pile burning, do it. If you can wait 3 years and the madrone has started to resprout and you're going to be able to kind of knock back some of that, that's wonderful. But again, it's so difficult to do prescribed burns in our area. The permitting and weather windows are so narrow. I think just go for it as much as you can. In 10 years' time, you might have a little bit of regrowth that you might want to go through with a chainsaw and just knock down. And then the prescribed burn is going to be able to burn some of that stuff up. I think we've actually gotten to a point where we almost clean up too much, where it's sometimes difficult to implement a prescribed burn because there's not enough fuel to really carry it. And so kind of having that in between might be ideal, or letting some madrone resprout come back and then either weed eating it down or again knocking it back with a chainsaw but leaving it in place, and then allowing the understory burn to creep across and consume all of that will be better. So it's always good to do it, whether it's immediately afterwards or 10 years later. Like, it's always going to be a better situation than not.
Okay, point taken. Alan asks if you can talk about flame length or height of ground flame, ground fire with or without prescribed burn. So maybe the difference.
Again, it's variable. So depending on whether you have like a foot of pine duff that your fire is burning through, or do you have a whole bunch of sticks and twigs, and again, like what the initial state was versus afterwards. If a wildfire goes through 1 year after a prescribed burn was done, it probably won't actually go through because there won't be enough fuel to carry it. And at the same time, sometimes if we burn too intensely an area that hasn't had all the normal fire that we're used to, even the ground fire can be too intense. So sometimes ideally, you only want to burn a tiny bit of that duff layer over and over again with only 1 foot flame lengths. So it's really an extremely variable question in an extremely variable process.
John Price asks, what are your thoughts on the current regulatory environment? Do we need to make it easier for prescribed burning to happen given current wildfire risk? So I guess, is there more policy work that needs to happen to make prescribed fire easier for folks to use?
You want to go first, Chris?
Well, lots to say. There has been good progress in the last 5 years. Aaron mentioned the Certified Burn Manager program that was created to certify people to lead burns, and the liability program that was created to cover the potential costs of damages should they occur. And so those have been positive developments. We see at the national level that there's a push by the EPA to remind states to not limit prescribed burn usage based on smoke restrictions. We know that if we actually are able to do enough prescribed burning, that will limit wildfire emissions. So we're a long way from that, spoiler alert, but theoretically, we could reduce the overall amount of emissions if we were using prescribed fire at a large enough scale. But that doesn't mean we have to make emissions somehow. There's smoke, right? There's smoke from prescribed fire. But, at the national level, the directive is to remind states that they should not be using the restrictions on prescribed burning to fulfill their air quality standards. So there are some things like that going on. But on the other hand, a lot of the prescribed burning limitations that we encounter in the state of Oregon are just the product of the fact that it's just a low priority. I think for a lot of our agencies, and that even though there are programs that promote the use of prescribed fire, make it easier, we're still very entrenched in a culture of we're just going to put fires out, and that's the solution. And there's a growing recognition that that's not enough, but attitudes take a long time to change. And so there's a lot of resistance to people using prescribed fire, even though it's a very popular tool. And our surveys over and over again show a very high level of popular support for the use of prescribed fire, 80% plus, wherever you do these surveys. So it's really a popular thing, which in a lot of other topics in forest management are a lot more divisive than prescribed fire, right? Mm-hmm. And yet we're seeing sometimes that these regulatory agencies are lagging behind the public opinion on that topic. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done to really entrench at the state level prescribed fire as a priority for use across boundaries, but especially I'd say on private lands, since that's where state has jurisdiction. Aaron?
Yeah, and I'll say it's certainly the regulatory environment, but if you really look at the regulations actually are fairly supportive. I think there's other parties who are in charge of the permitting process that are kind of limiting it. Both at the state level, there's a lot of support, and at the local public level, there's a lot of support. I mean, 80%, can you imagine 80% support for anything in our current culture? Like, that's incredible. So there's a lot of support on the ground, and there's a lot of support at the state, but there's an in-between group of individuals that are kind of committed to reducing the amount of prescribed burning we use. And unfortunately, rather than being science-based or experienced practitioner-based, it's become political. And an ODF staff member who's smarter than I am told me recently, he said, and once politics gets involved, something stupid's going to happen. So unfortunately, we're kind of at this level where the science, the facts, none of that really is playing into the decision-making around when prescribed fire is allowed. And I really appreciate your question, John. I'm just not sure how to move that forward other than continuing to show the support and interest at the community level for more prescribed burning, because we have to show that people want this to happen. It needs to happen. The status quo of just suppressing all fire, and well, it hasn't worked in 100 years, so maybe if we just suppress it harder, it'll soon work. Like, that's just not realistic. And so we need to look for alternatives like prescribed burning in order to try and work with this wildfire risk. So thank you, John. Tom, to your question, my understanding is that yes, electric chainsaws are usable during high fire protection levels. I agree with you that chains on rocks seem like they're more of a spark producer than the exhaust from chainsaws, but that's way beyond my pay scale, so to speak.
Caitlin asks here if there are books that you'd recommend on prescribed burning or historical burning within our region.
I agree with Chris's answer. Anything by Stephen Pine is really good for sure.
I was thinking along those same lines. My question was, we see that indigenous people are getting back into burning, getting the opportunity to burn some of, areas that provide cultural food sources and have trees. Is there anywhere we could turn, either book or perhaps, group that's sort of taking a leadership position in prescribed fire? Where can we go to learn more about indigenous fire practices and sort of how they're utilizing it today and in today's world? I know the Klamath there's been a lot of burning and stuff going on down there. Is there anywhere people can turn to learn more about indigenous fire use in today's world?
There are a lot of documentaries now and films that you can find on YouTube, many of which are made by folks in tribal communities. Particularly, I'm thinking of the Karuk tribe in Northern California. They put out a lot of media about cultural burning. So if you look up Karuk tribe, fire use, traditional burning, or whatever, they have their own website. They have website. They have lots of resources that they've created. And like I said, several documentaries also about the Yurok tribe. And some of those books that I put in the chat, Tending the Land and Indians Fire in the Land in the Pacific Northwest, are good books about the topic of indigenous land management that I think are very important. It's a very important topic to when we think about the history. Stephen Pine has written many books about fire, many. So pick whichever one you want. He has one about the Pacific Northwest. It's not so much about tribes specifically, but that's out there. Trying to think of anything else. If it comes to me, I'll put it in the chat.
Well, thank you. And I think that's it for our questions. So unless anybody else has something they want to throw in there real quickly, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up and let these guys off the hook. Thank you, Aaron. And thank you, Chris, for this presentation and for bringing this information to us. Such an important topic for our region that should have burned every 7 to 10 years. So lots of folks throwing some appreciation in there too. And Caitlin says there that Kat Anderson is speaking at the Siskiyou Chapter Native Plant Society third Thursday in April 26, free to the public. All right, guys. Well, with that, thanks everybody for being here. And you'll see a link. Keep an eye out for the email. It comes from the same registration system that you signed up for this on, and there'll be a link to the recording of this presentation that you can review or share with a friend. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.